Some loves never truly die. They just wait in the corners of our hearts until life calls them back. Marcus Bell thought his chance with Dana was buried 30 years deep, until he saw her face on the evening news. Alone and abandoned. At 58, this auto mechanic with calloused hands drove straight to the courthouse when he saw Dana Royce on TV. The ambitious girl who'd left him behind was now a powerful CEO facing fraud charges. Her expensive lawyers had walked out, leaving her alone. Marcus burst through those courtroom doors and shouted words that shocked everyone. "I will defend her." The entire room went silent. Seasoned attorneys stared. The judge raised an eyebrow, but Dana looked at him and nodded, yes. What could make a successful CEO trust her defense to a man with grease under his fingernails? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 30 years ago, love had a different face in the small industrial town of Millbrook. It was 1994 when Marcus Bell first laid eyes on Dana Williams. Not Royce yet, that name would come with her first marriage, as she stepped out of a beaten-up Honda Civic in the employee parking lot of Techno Solutions, Inc. She was 22, fresh out of college, with a computer science degree and dreams bigger than the cramped cubicles that awaited her. He was 28, the maintenance supervisor who kept the building's temperamental heating system running and the ancient elevator from dropping 3 floors without warning. Marcus had been watching from the loading dock when she struggled. With a box of personal items, her heels clicking uncertainly on the cracked asphalt. Without thinking, he jogged over, his work boots steady on the same surface that seemed to challenge her every step. "Let me help you with that," he'd said, reaching for the box. Dana had looked up at him, really looked, and something had shifted. In the universe, she was beautiful, certainly, with skin the color of warm honey and eyes that held intelligence and determination. But it wasn't just her beauty that stopped Marcus in his tracks. It was the way she straightened her shoulders, the way she met his gaze directly, the way she said "thank you," as if she truly meant it, not as if accepting help diminished her somehow. "I'm Marcus," he'd said, "Dana, and I think I'm lost already." He'd laughed, a deep, warm sound that would become familiar to her over the months that followed. "That's okay. This place is like a maze until you figure it out. I've been here 6 years, and I still take wrong turns sometimes." The building had been a converted textile mill, all exposed brick and narrow hallways that seemed to lead nowhere. Dana's cubicle was on the 3rd floor, tucked between the accounting department and a supply closet that Marcus had converted into his unofficial workshop. It meant he passed by her desk several times a day, checking vents, replacing fluorescent bulbs, fixing the perpetually jamming printer that sat 3 desks down from hers. At first their conversations were brief, good mornings, comments about the weather, her asking where to find the good coffee. But slowly, carefully, like 2 people learning to trust thin ice, they began to talk about real things. She told him about growing up in Detroit, about her mother who cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Dana's education, about her dreams of starting her own tech company someday. He told her about his plans to eventually open his own garage, about the house he was slowly renovating on weekends, about books he read and movies that made him think. It was Dana who made the first move. 3 months after she'd started at Techno Solutions, she'd appeared at his workshop door, holding 2 cups of coffee and a shy smile. "I was wondering," she'd said, "if you might want to get dinner sometime. Somewhere that isn't the vending machine." Their first date was at Tony's Diner on Main Street, a place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that only played songs from before they were born. They talked for 4 hours, until the waitress started pointedly wiping down tables around them. Marcus learned that Dana could quote entire scenes from The Princess Bride, and that she was afraid of spiders, but not of speaking up in meetings full of men twice her age. Dana discovered that Marcus had read every book in the library's philosophy section and could fix literally anything with an engine. The next 6 months were the happiest of Marcus's life. They fit together in ways that surprised them both. She would come by his workshop during lunch breaks, perching on his workbench while he explained the intricate workings of the heating system. He would pick her up after work, and she would tell him about the project she was developing, the improvements she wanted to make to the company's systems, the ways she could see technology changing everything. On weekends, he would work on his house, a modest 2-bedroom place with good bones and terrible plumbing, while she sat nearby with her laptop, writing code and occasionally looking up to watch him work with his hands. There was something meditative about those Saturday afternoons, the sound of his tools mixing with the tap of her keyboard, both of them building something for the future. But the future, as futures often do, had other plans. The opportunity came in the form of Dana Royce, a venture capitalist from Chicago who visited Techno Solutions to scout talent. He was 35, polished in a way that made Marcus feel suddenly aware of the permanent grease under his fingernails. Jonathan wore suits that cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, drove a car that purred instead of rumbling, and when he looked at Dana, he saw not just a brilliant programmer, but a potential partner in every sense of the word. "She's got something special," Jonathan had told the company's CEO after spending an afternoon reviewing Dana's proposals. "I'd like to offer her a position with my new startup in Chicago, senior developer, equity stake, chance to build something revolutionary." The night Dana told Marcus about the offer, they were sitting on the porch of his half-renovated house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She'd been quiet all evening, picking at the dinner he'd cooked. Not quite. Meeting his eyes. "It's everything I've dreamed of," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Real money, real responsibility, chance to change how people interact with technology." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's wonderful," he said, and meant it, even as part of him was already calculating the distance between Millbrook and Chicago. "I'd be the only black woman on the development team, maybe the only black woman Jonathan's ever hired at that level." Dana's fingers twisted together in her lap. "My mother cleaned offices her whole life so I could have opportunities like this." "You should go," Marcus said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "This is your chance." Dana turned to look at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Come with me." For a moment Marcus let himself imagine it, leaving behind his workshop, his house, his plans for the garage, starting over in a city where he knew no one, where he'd be just another black man with rough hands and a high school education in a world of college degrees and corporate ambitions. "What would I do there?" he asked gently. "You're brilliant, Marcus. You could do anything," but they both knew it wasn't that simple. The world Dana was entering, conferences and presentations, networking events and business dinners, wasn't built for men like Marcus. He would be an anchor around her rising star, a reminder of where she came from instead of a partner in where she was going. "You should go," he said again, this time taking her hand. "And you should go without looking back." The breakup was gentle, as breakups between people who truly love each other sometimes are. They didn't fight or blame or make promises they couldn't keep. They simply held each other on that porch as the last light faded from the sky, memorizing the feeling of being understood completely by another human being. Dana left Millbrook on a Tuesday morning in October. Marcus didn't go to the train station. They'd agreed it would be easier that way. Instead, he went to work early and spent the day replacing every light fixture in the building, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. That evening, alone in his workshop, he found the photograph she'd left behind. It was from the company picnic in August, both of them laughing at something someone had said, her hand on his arm, his head thrown back in genuine joy. On the back, she'd written, "Thank you for showing me what it feels like to be truly seen. D." Marcus had stared at that photograph for a long time before tucking it into his toolbox beneath the wrenches and screwdrivers that were the tools of his trade. He told himself he'd throw it away eventually, when the hurt wasn't so sharp. But eventually had never come. 3 years later, he married Sarah Mitchell, a nurse at the county hospital who was kind and steady, and never asked about the sadness that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. Sarah had loved him with the fierce, protective love of someone who understood that some wounds never fully heal. She'd given him 22 good years, a daughter named Angela, and the kind of peace that comes from being accepted exactly as you are. When Sarah died, cancer, quick and merciless despite all her medical knowledge, Marcus thought he might die too, but Angela needed him, and the garage he'd finally opened needed him, and somehow he'd learned to carry his grief like a familiar weight, heavy but manageable. Now, at 58, Marcus Bell was a man at peace with his choices. His garage, Bell's Auto Repair, sat on the edge of Millbrook's small downtown, a tidy building with 2 bays and a reputation for honest work at fair prices. His customers trusted him because he told them the truth, when their car could be saved and when it was time to let go. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his back ached most mornings, and he was proud of both. Angela was 26 now, a teacher like her mother had wanted to be before nursing called to her. She worried about him living alone, about him working too hard, about him never dating anyone since Sarah's death 5 years ago. She didn't know about the photograph still tucked in his toolbox, or about the woman whose face sometimes appeared on the business news. Older now, but still unmistakably the girl who had changed everything. Until tonight, when Dana Royce, successful, powerful, untouchable Dana Royce, had appeared on his television screen looking more alone than he'd ever seen her. The news anchor's voice had been carefully neutral, the kind of professional detachment that accompanied stories about corporate fraud and fallen executives. But Marcus had seen something else in the footage of Dana walking up the courthouse. Steps, a brittleness around her eyes, a set to her shoulders that spoke of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. Tech CEO Dana Royce's legal team has withdrawn from her defense just days before closing arguments, the anchor had said. Sources close to the case suggest disagreements over strategy, leaving Royce to face fraud charges that could result in decades in prison. The camera had caught her just as her lead attorney, a silver-haired man in a $3,000 suit, brushed past reporters without comment. Dana had stood alone on those courthouse steps for just a moment, and in that moment, Marcus had seen not the powerful CEO the world knew her as, but the 22-year-old girl who had once sat in his workshop, dreaming of changing the world. He'd turned off the television and sat in the silence of his small living room above the garage. Sarah's reading chair, still positioned by the window, where she used to grade papers in the afternoon light. The photograph was still in his toolbox downstairs. He'd never been able to throw it away, even after all these years, even after Sarah's gentle teasing about his mysterious past. Marcus had tried to sleep, but Dana's face kept appearing in his mind. Not the composed executive from the news footage, but Dana laughing at something he'd said. Dana concentrating on her code while he worked on a broken heater. Dana crying on his porch the night she'd told him about Chicago. At 4 in the morning, he'd given up on sleep and gone down to the garage. Working on engines had always helped him think, the methodical process of diagnosis and repair soothing. In a way that few things were. He'd had Mrs. Peterson's Buick up on the lift, a straightforward transmission issue that would take most of the day to fix properly. But instead of reaching for his tools, he'd found himself opening his toolbox and staring down at that photograph. 30 years of marriage, widowhood, and carefully constructed peace, and he could still remember exactly how it felt to make her laugh. The courthouse was a 40-minute drive from Millbrook, a stately brick building that had intimidated generations of defendants and their families. Marcus had only been inside once, for jury duty 15 years ago, And he'd spent most of that week wondering how anyone could concentrate on justice in a room that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. He'd arrived just as the circus was reaching full swing. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward a grey October sky. Reporters stood in neat clusters, checking their phones and sipping coffee from foam cups. Security barriers kept the crowds at bay, but Marcus could feel the electricity in the air, the sense of anticipation that surrounded public downfalls. Through the courthouse windows, he could see figures moving in the hallways, attorneys in dark suits, court personnel, the machinery of justice grinding forward. And somewhere in that building was Dana, facing the collapse of everything she'd built. Marcus had parked his pickup truck, a 15-year-old Ford with rust spots and a tailgate held closed by bungee cords, between a news van and a luxury sedan that probably cost more than his garage brought in during a good year. The contrast wasn't lost on him. In his work clothes and steel-toed boots, he looked exactly like what he was, a working man who belonged somewhere else. The security checkpoint inside the courthouse had been a small humiliation. The metal detector had beeped at his belt buckle, his work knife, the handful of change in his pocket. A young guard had wanded him with the bored efficiency of someone who processed hundreds of people a day, never making eye contact, never wondering why a mechanic from Millbrook might need to be in a federal courthouse on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom itself was smaller than it had looked on television, but no less intimidating. Dark wood paneling rose to a coffered ceiling, and tall windows filtered the autumn light into something solemn and official. The gallery was packed with reporters, legal observers, and the merely curious, all of them waiting for the day's drama to unfold. And there, at the defendant's table, sat Dana. She looked older, certainly. 51 now, her hair shorter than it had been in their youth, touches of silver at her temples that somehow made her more beautiful rather than less. She wore a navy suit that was clearly expensive but not flashy, the kind of careful choice made by someone who understood that every detail would be scrutinized. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she was staring straight ahead with the kind of focused attention that Marcus remembered from their Saturday afternoons, when she would lose herself in her code while he worked nearby. But the table beside her was empty. No attorneys, no briefcases full of legal strategies, no one to stand between her and the prosecution team that occupied the other side of the courtroom like an army in matching suits. Marcus had found a seat in the back, among the overflow crowd that pressed against the gallery's boundaries. He told himself he was just there to see her, to understand what had happened to the girl who had once believed she could change the world. He hadn't planned what happened next. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort, had called the court to order. The prosecution had risen smoothly, ready to begin. Their closing arguments against a defendant who had no one left to speak for her. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor had said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew he'd already won. "The defendant has had ample time to secure representation. Her previous counsel's withdrawal doesn't change the fact that justice delayed is justice denied." Dana had started to stand, and Marcus had seen her hands shake just slightly before she steadied them. In that moment, she looked so alone that it broke something fundamental in his chest, the same protective instinct that had made him offer to carry her box 30 years ago, that had made him want to shield her from every sharp corner the world might show her, rose up with a force that surprised him. "I will defend her," the words had torn from his throat before he'd fully decided to speak them. The entire courtroom had gone silent, not just quiet, but silent in the way that follows explosions, when everyone is still processing what they've just witnessed. Marcus had been on his feet, pushing through the gallery toward the front of the courtroom, his work boots loud on the polished floor. Security had moved to intercept him, but the judge had held up a hand. "Sir, this is highly irregular." "Your Honor," This woman doesn't have anyone to speak for her, and that's not right. Marcus had reached the front of the courtroom now, close enough to see Dana's face clearly for the first time in 30 years. Her eyes were wide with shock, but underneath that he saw something else, a flicker of the girl who had once trusted him completely. "Sir, are you an attorney?" "No, ma'am. I'm a mechanic. But I know this woman, and I know she's not the criminal. They're trying to make her out to be." The prosecutor had been on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is a circus. The defendant can't just— The defendant can speak for herself," the judge had said crisply. Her attention had turned to Dana, who was still staring at Marcus as if he were a ghost. "Ms. Royce, do you wish this gentleman to represent you?" For a long moment, the courtroom had held its breath. Dana's eyes had moved from Marcus to the judge, to the gallery full of reporters and observers, all of them waiting for her answer. When she'd looked back at Marcus, he'd seen 30 years collapse into nothing. The girl in the Honda Civic, the woman on his porch saying goodbye, the CEO on trial for her freedom, all of them present in her gaze. "Yes," she'd said quietly. Then louder, "Yes, Your Honor, I would like Mr. Bell to represent me." The explosion of noise from the gallery, reporters shouting questions, observers murmuring to each other, the bailiff calling for order, had washed over them like a wave. But Marcus had only seen Dana's face, the way her shoulders had straightened, as if accepting his help had given her back some essential part of herself. The judge had hammered her gavel until the courtroom quieted. "Mr. Bell, I'm going to grant a 24-hour recess to allow you to familiarize yourself with the case, but I want to be very clear. This court expects competent representation regardless of your background. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus had said. "I understand completely." As the courtroom had emptied around them, Marcus and Dana had stood facing each other across 30 years of silence. She'd aged beautifully, he'd thought, the way some people do when they've lived fully and learned from their mistakes. But there were lines around her eyes that spoke of stress, of carrying weight that wasn't meant to be carried alone. "Marcus," she'd said, and his name in her voice had sounded exactly the way he remembered. "Hey, Dana," he'd replied. "Looks like you could use a mechanic." The law library at Millbrook Community College stayed open until midnight, a fact Marcus had never needed to know until he found himself there at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, surrounded by legal textbooks that might as well have been written in a foreign language. He'd checked out everything he could carry: criminal law for beginners, corporate fraud investigation, courtroom procedures, and a thick volume called Federal Rules of Evidence that seemed designed to cure insomnia. Jerome Washington, Marcus's best friend since high school and a retired police detective, had found him there hunched over a yellow legal pad, trying to decode the difference between direct examination and cross-examination. "Man, what are you doing to yourself?" Jerome had asked, sliding into the chair across from Marcus. At 60, Jerome still carried himself like the cop he'd been for 30 years, alert, observant, skeptical of easy answers. "Learning how not to send Dana to prison," Marcus had replied without looking up from his notes. "And you think you can?" Learned 30 years of law school in one night. Marcus had finally raised his head, and Jerome had seen the exhaustion already setting in. "I don't know, Jerome. I honestly don't know what I'm doing, but I stood up in that courtroom and said I'd defend her, and I meant it." Jerome had studied his friend's face, seeing something there he hadn't seen in years, not since Sarah's diagnosis, when Marcus had thrown himself into researching every treatment, every clinical trial, every possibility that might give them more time together. "This is about more than just helping someone in trouble, isn't it?" Marcus had been quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the textbook in front of him. "You remember when I told you about the girl who got away? The one from before Sarah? The computer programmer who went to Chicago? That's her, that's Dana." Jerome had leaned back in his chair, processing this information. In all the years they'd been friends, through Marcus's marriage and Sarah's death and everything in between, he'd never seen Marcus look the way he looked talking about this woman. And now she's on trial for fraud And you're what? Riding to the rescue? She didn't do it, Marcus had said with quiet certainty. I may not know much about corporate law, but I know Dana Williams. She's got more integrity in her little finger than most people have in their whole body. Williams. Thought her name was Royce. Married name. From her first husband, I think. She kept it for business after they divorced. Jerome had watched his friend for another moment, then reached across the table to close the textbook Marcus had been struggling with. Okay, what do you need? By the time they'd left the library, they'd had something resembling a plan. Jerome would use his contacts in law enforcement to dig into the background of the case, looking for inconsistencies or leads the defense might have missed. Marcus would focus on understanding the specific charges and the evidence the prosecution had presented. And somehow in the next 24 hours, Marcus would try to become competent enough not to embarrass himself or Dana in federal court. The next morning, Marcus had arrived at the courthouse at 7 a.m., 2 hours before visiting time started. He'd sat in his pickup truck in the parking garage, reviewing his notes and trying to calm the nerves that felt like live wires under his skin. At exactly 9 o'clock, he'd presented himself at the security checkpoint, been processed through the metal detector, and found his way to the attorney-client meeting room where Dana was waiting. She looked smaller without the courtroom around. Her, wearing an orange jumpsuit that washed out her complexion and made her look older than her 51 years. But when she smiled at him, the same slightly lopsided smile he remembered from 30 years ago, she became Dana again. Not the defendant or the CEO, just the woman he'd once loved completely. I can't believe you're here, she'd said as he settled into the plastic chair across from her. I can't believe I'm here either, Marcus had admitted. But here we are. They'd stared at each other across the small table, 30 years of separation, suddenly feeling both like forever and like no time at all. She looked tired, Marcus had thought, but not defeated. There was still steel in her spine, still the determination that had carried her from a cubicle in Millbrook to a corner office in Chicago. Marcus, I need you to understand something, Dana had said, her voice quiet but clear. I didn't do what they're saying I did, but I also need you to understand that defending me could destroy your reputation in this town. People are going to say you're a fool or worse. Your business could suffer. Your daughter, Angela's fine. Marcus had interrupted. She's worried about me, but she understands why I'm doing this. Do you understand why you're doing this? Marcus had been quiet for a moment, considering his answer. He could have said it was about justice or friendship or simple human decency. All of those would have been true, but they wouldn't have been the whole truth. I understand that 30 years ago I let you walk away because I thought you'd be better off without me. I understand that I've spent 3 decades wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to fight for us then. And I understand that this might be the last chance I get to prove to myself that I'm the kind of man who doesn't give up on people he cares about. Dana's eyes had filled with tears, but she'd blinked them back. Marcus, you were never the problem. What happened between us? We'll have time to talk about what happened between us, Marcus had said gently. Right now, I need you to help me understand what's happening to you now. For the next hour, Dana had walked him through the charges. The prosecution claimed she had manipulated the company's books, inflated revenue numbers, and hidden losses to attract investors and boost stock prices. They said she had personally profited from stock sales while knowing the company was in financial trouble. They painted a picture of corporate greed and deliberate deception that could result in 15 years in federal prison. The thing is, Dana had said, her voice growing stronger as she explained, I wasn't even directly involved in most of the financial reporting they're talking about. I was focused on product development, on the technology side. Jonathan, my business partner, he handled the investor relations, the financial projections, all of that. Jonathan Royce, your ex-husband. Yes, We founded the company together right after we got married. When we divorced, we agreed to remain business partners. It worked well for a long time. He understood money, I understood technology. But in the last few years, as the company grew, I started to feel like I was being pushed out of decision-making processes. Marcus had made notes on his legal pad, his mechanic's mind already working to break down the problem into component parts. So if you weren't involved in the financial side, how are they connecting you to the fraud? My signature is on some of the SEC filings. As CEO, I was ultimately responsible for the accuracy of all company reports, even if I didn't personally prepare them. Dana had rubbed her temples, a gesture Marcus remembered from their youth when she was working through a particularly difficult piece of code. But Marcus, I swear to you, I never knowingly signed anything false. If there were problems with those reports, I wasn't told about them. Who would have told you? Who else had access to the financial information? Jonathan, obviously, our CFO, Michael Torres, a few other senior executives. Dana had paused, something flickering across her face. The strange thing is, right before the SEC investigation started, several of my senior staff started avoiding me. People I'd worked with for years suddenly couldn't look me in the eye. Marcus had underlined that note twice. In his experience, when people started acting guilty before they were accused of anything, it usually meant they knew something was coming. Dana, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Is there any possibility that your business partners set you up, that they committed the fraud and made sure the evidence would point to you? Dana had been quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded on the table between them. When she'd finally looked up, Marcus had seen something new in her expression, not just fear or sadness, but anger. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. Jonathan and I may not have been good as a married couple, but I trusted him as a business partner. But now, thinking back on how strange everyone's been acting, how many meetings I wasn't invited to in the months before the investigation started, she'd taken a shaky breath. Marcus, I think they did. I think they set me up to take the fall for all of it. Marcus had closed his notebook and reached across the table to cover her hands with his own. Her skin was soft, he'd noticed, despite everything she'd been through. The hands of someone who worked with her mind instead of her muscles. Then that's where we start, he'd said. We prove they set you up, and we make sure they pay for it. For the first time since he'd seen her on the courthouse steps, Dana had smiled, really smiled, not the careful expression she'd worn in court, but the brilliant, transformative smile that had once made him believe anything was possible. You. Know what, Marcus Bell? I think you might just make a pretty good lawyer after all. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with Sarah's wedding ring turning slowly between his fingers. He'd worn it on a chain around his neck since her funeral, unable to put it away, but no longer able to wear it on his hand. Now, with Dana back in his life, the simple gold band felt heavier somehow, weighted with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Sarah would have understood, he told himself. She'd always known about the photograph in his toolbox, had never asked him to throw it away or pretend his past hadn't happened. We all have people who shaped us, she'd said once, finding him looking thoughtful after a news story had mentioned a tech company's CEO named Dana Royce. The important thing is being grateful for the love we had, not guilty about it. But knowing Sarah would have understood didn't make the guilt any less real. He was 58 years old, a widower who'd made peace with the idea that his great love story was behind him. The feelings stirring in his chest as he thought about Dana's smile, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd promised to prove her innocence, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd built with Sarah. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. Angela's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus felt a familiar mixture of warmth and worry. His daughter had inherited her mother's gift for knowing when something was troubling him, even from across town. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered, tucking the ring back inside his shirt. Dad, I just saw the news. Angela's voice carried the particular blend of concern and exasperation that daughters perfect when talking to fathers who've done something both admirable and foolish. They're saying you're defending some CEO in a federal fraud case. Please tell me that's not true. Marcus leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. It's true. Her name is Dana, and she's innocent. Dad, you're not a lawyer. You fix cars. I know what I am, Angela. But I also know Dana, and she didn't do what they're saying she did. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could practically hear his daughter thinking. Angela was a teacher, like Sarah had wanted to be, and she'd inherited her mother's ability to cut through emotion to reach the truth underneath. This is about the woman from the photograph, isn't it? The one in your toolbox that you think I don't know about. Marcus felt his heart skip. You knew about that? Dad, I've been in and out of your garage my whole life. Of course I knew about it. Mom knew too. Angela's voice softened. She told me once that everyone has a road not taken and that the photograph was yours. She wasn't threatened by it because she knew you'd chosen her, chosen us, chosen the life you built together. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. And she'd probably tell you that defending this woman is either the bravest thing you've ever done or the most foolish, and maybe both. Angela paused again. Dad, are you sure about this? Really sure? Marcus looked around his small kitchen, at the table where he and Sarah had shared thousands of meals, at the window where she used to stand doing dishes while telling him about her day. This had been a good life, a peaceful life, but Dana was sitting in a jail cell, facing 15 years in prison for something she didn't do, and he was the only person who believed in her innocence enough to fight for it. I'm sure, he said quietly. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I can promise I won't give up on her. Then I guess we better figure out how to help you not embarrass yourself too badly in court. The relief that flooded through Marcus was immediate and overwhelming. Dad, you raised me to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. You think I'm going to let you do this alone? Angela's voice took on the determined tone that reminded Marcus so much of Sarah. I'll be there tomorrow, front row. And if you need me to help with research or anything else, just ask. After they hung up, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, exactly, but a sense of rightness that had been missing since he'd impulsively stood up in that courtroom. He wasn't doing this alone. He had his daughter's support, Jerome's investigative skills, and somewhere deep in his heart, Sarah's blessing. The next morning brought the reality of what he'd committed to. Marcus arrived at the courthouse 2 hours early, his stomach churning with nerves and caffeine. He'd traded his usual work clothes for the only suit he owned, a navy blue one he'd bought for Sarah's funeral, and shoes that pinched his feet but looked appropriately serious. The prosecution team was already there when he entered the courtroom, 4 attorneys in matching grey suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a catalogue for Successful Lawyers Monthly. They glanced at him with the kind of polite dismissal usually reserved for court reporters and bailiffs, clearly not recognizing the threat posed by a small-town mechanic with a borrowed briefcase. Marcus took his place at the defendant's table and spread out his notes, trying to look more confident than he felt. He'd spent the night reviewing every piece of evidence the prosecution had presented, looking for inconsistencies and gaps with the same methodical approach he used to diagnose engine problems. The pattern that emerged was troubling, almost. Everything pointed directly at Dana, but in a way that felt too neat, too convenient. When Dana was brought in, she looked steadier than she had the day before. She'd managed to do something with her hair despite the limitations of jail, and her orange jumpsuit was pressed and clean. Most importantly, her eyes were clear and focused, no longer carrying the defeated look that had broken Marcus's heart when he first saw her on the courthouse steps. "How are you holding up?" he asked as she settled beside him. "Better, knowing you're here." She squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture so familiar it seemed to collapse 30 years into nothing. "Marcus, I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday about Jonathan and the others possibly setting me up. I remembered something. What? 3 months ago, Jonathan insisted I sign some updated corporate governance documents. Said it was routine stuff, updating our internal procedures to comply with new SEC regulations. I trusted him, so I signed without reading every detail. Dana's voice was tight with anger at her own naivety. What if those documents somehow made me more legally responsible for financial reporting than I realized? Marcus made a note on his legal pad. We'll need to get copies of everything you signed. Jerome's working on that. He's got contacts who might be able to help us get access to documents the prosecution didn't include in their evidence. Jerome, my best friend, retired detective. He's convinced there's more to this story than what we're seeing in court. Before Dana could respond, the bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Morrison entered. She was a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Marcus had done his research on her the night before, 30 years on the federal bench, known for being fair but demanding, intolerant of grandstanding but respectful of genuine effort. "Mr. Bell," she said as the courtroom settled, "are you prepared to proceed with your defense?" Marcus stood, his knees only slightly unsteady. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense is ready." "Very well. Please call your first witness." This was the moment Marcus had been dreading. In his crash course in legal procedures, he'd learned that the defense typically presented character witnesses, expert testimony, alternative theories of the crime, all things that required resources and expertise he didn't possess. But he'd also learned something else. Sometimes the best defense was simply telling the truth in a way that made people listen. "Your Honor, the defense calls Dana Royce." A murmur went through the gallery. Defendants rarely testified in their own cases, especially in complex white-collar crimes where a single wrong answer could provide the prosecution with everything they needed for conviction. But Marcus had made this decision carefully. Dana was her own best witness, the person who could best explain the complexity of the company's structure and her actual role in the alleged fraud. As Dana stood and moved to the witness stand, Marcus caught sight of Angela in the front row of the gallery, giving him an encouraging nod. Jerome was there too, along with a handful of people from Millbrook who'd driven down to show their support. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for these people who believed in him even when he wasn't. Sure, he believed in himself. "Ms. Royce," Marcus began, his voice steadier than he'd expected, "please tell the court about your role in the day-to-day operations of Royce Technologies." And for the next hour, Dana told her story, not as a defendant trying to avoid responsibility, but as a woman who had built something she was proud of, only to watch it be used against her by people she had trusted. She spoke about the technology her company had developed, about the employees who had believed in their mission, about her growing concern in the months before the SEC investigation when she found herself increasingly excluded from financial decisions. The prosecution objected frequently, clearly uncomfortable with the narrative Dana was weaving. But Judge Morrison allowed most of her testimony, and Marcus could see several jurors leaning forward, engaged by Dana's clear, honest answers. When Marcus finished his direct examination, the lead prosecutor rose for cross-examination with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the cards. But as he began his aggressive questioning, trying to trap Dana in contradictions or admissions of guilt, Marcus saw something shift in the jury's attention. They weren't hearing a guilty woman making excuses. They were hearing someone telling the truth, even when that truth was painful. By the time court recessed for lunch, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: hope. They still had a long way to go, and he knew the prosecution had ammunition they hadn't used yet. But for the first time since this whole journey began, Marcus believed they might actually have a chance to prove Dana's innocence. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on Marcus's third night as a defense attorney. He was sitting in his garage office, surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups, when his phone buzzed with a text from Jerome. "Found something. Meet." Me at Denny's in 20. Marcus had been poring over financial documents until his eyes burned, trying to understand the maze of corporate structures and money transfers that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. His mechanic's mind kept insisting there was a pattern here, a logic to the way money had moved through the company's accounts, but the pattern remained just out of reach. Jerome was already in a back booth when Marcus arrived, looking like he hadn't slept either. The retired detective had that look Marcus remembered from their younger days when Jerome was working a case that had gotten under his skin, focused, energized, slightly dangerous. "You need to see this," Jerome said without preamble, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Remember how you said it felt like the evidence was too neat, like someone had gift-wrapped Dana for the prosecution?" Marcus opened the folder and found bank records, email printouts, and what looked like internal corporate memos. "How did you get these?" "I still have friends in the financial crimes unit. Turns out they've been quietly investigating Royce Technologies for longer than anyone realized, not because of the SEC complaint, but because of some unusual banking activity that raised red flags about 18 months ago." "What kind of unusual activity?" Jerome leaned forward, his voice dropping to the level of conversation they'd used as teenagers planning elaborate pranks. "Money moving in and out of offshore accounts. Shell companies being created and dissolved. The kind of financial choreography you see when someone's trying to hide assets or make legitimate money look dirty, or dirty money look legitimate." Marcus studied the documents, his mind working to translate the financial jargon into concepts he could understand. And Dana wasn't involved in setting up these accounts? That's the beautiful part. Look at the signatures on these bank authorizations, the dates on these shell company incorporations. They all trace back to Jonathan Royce and Michael Torres, the CFO. Dana's name appears on exactly none of them. Jerome pulled out another document. But here's where it gets interesting. 3 months ago, right around the time Dana told you she signed those governance documents, someone started moving money through these accounts in a way that would create a paper trail leading directly back to her. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Someone set up the shell companies to launder money, then used Dana's updated corporate authority to make it look like she was the one giving the orders. Exactly. And if I'm reading this right, they timed the whole thing perfectly. The SEC investigation was triggered by an anonymous tip, someone who claimed to have inside knowledge of fraud at Royce Technologies. Want to guess when that tip came in? Right after Dana signed the documents, 2 days after. And here's the kicker. The whistleblower specifically mentioned transactions that could only be traced using Dana's new corporate signatures. It's like someone handed the SEC a roadmap with Dana's name on every street sign. Marcus leaned back in the diner booth, feeling pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a well-tuned engine. So Jonathan and Torres have been stealing from the company for over a year, using shell companies to hide the money. But they needed someone to blame when it inevitably came to light. And who better than the CEO, who'd been gradually pushed out of financial decision-making? Dana was the perfect patsy, visible enough to satisfy investigators, isolated enough that she couldn't effectively defend herself. Jerome's expression darkened. These guys didn't just steal money, Marcus. They stole her life. Can we prove it in court? That's the million-dollar question. Most of this evidence was obtained through ongoing federal investigations that aren't public yet. My contacts shared it with me off the record because they're concerned that Dana's being prosecuted for crimes she didn't commit, while the real perpetrators walk free. Marcus studied the documents again, his mind already working on how to present this information in a way that would make sense to a jury. What about the encrypted files Dana mentioned? She said she'd been working on some kind of security project before the investigation started. Jerome's eyes lit up. That's another interesting piece. According to these banking records, someone's been trying to access encrypted files stored on Royce Technologies servers. multiple attempts, different approaches, like they're looking for something specific or trying to destroy something specific. Now you're thinking like a detective. Jerome gathered up the documents. Marcus, I think Dana stumbled onto the money laundering operation without realizing it. Maybe her security work uncovered evidence of the shell companies or irregular financial transfers. Jonathan and Torres realized she was getting too close, so they accelerated their timeline for framing her. Marcus felt a cold anger settling in his chest, the same protective fury he'd felt watching Dana stand alone at the defendant's table. They destroyed her life to cover up their crimes, and if we can prove it, they're going to prison for a very long time. The next morning in court, Marcus felt different. Not confident exactly. He was still a mechanic trying to practice law with 3 days of experience. But he had something now that he hadn't had before. A clear understanding of what had really happened and a plan for proving it. Judge Morrison had allowed him to recall Dana to the witness stand over the prosecution's strenuous objections. As she settled into the witness chair, Marcus could see that she sensed something had changed in his approach. "Ms. Royce," he began, "you mentioned yesterday that you'd been working on a security project in the months before the SEC investigation began. Can you tell us more about that?" "Objection, Your Honor. This wasn't covered in the prosecution's case. Goes to the defendant's state of mind and knowledge, Your Honor. The prosecution has argued that Ms. Royce was aware of financial irregularities. I'm trying to establish what she actually knew and when she knew it." Judge Morrison considered for a moment. "I'll allow it, but keep it relevant, Mr. Bell." Dana adjusted herself in the witness chair, and Marcus could see her gathering her thoughts. "I'd been asked by our board of directors to conduct a comprehensive security audit of our systems, not because of any specific concerns, but as part of our preparation for a potential public stock offering." "What did this audit involve?" "I was reviewing all of our data systems, looking for vulnerabilities, ensuring that sensitive information was properly protected. As part of that process, I was mapping all of our digital assets, every database, every server, every account that had access to company information." Marcus moved closer to the witness stand. "And did you find anything unusual during this audit?" Dana was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her thinking back to those final weeks before her world had collapsed. "I found financial databases that weren't part of our standard accounting system, servers I didn't recognize, digital signatures on transactions that I couldn't trace to any of our regular vendors or partners." "What did you do with this information?" "Brought it to Jonathan, my ex-husband, my business partner. I thought maybe it was part of some financial restructuring he was working on, something I hadn't been briefed on, because it wasn't related to the technology side of the business." "And what was his response?" "He seemed—" Dana paused, clearly, remembering something that had puzzled her at the time. "He seemed very concerned, not curious or interested in what I'd found, but worried. He told me to stop the audit, said the board had decided it wasn't necessary after all." Marcus felt the jury's attention sharpening. "Did you stop the audit?" "Not immediately. As a CEO, I felt responsible for understanding every aspect of our company's operations. So I continued reviewing the databases I'd already discovered, trying to understand what they were for." "And what did you find?" The prosecution rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This calls for speculation about financial records that haven't been entered into evidence." "Mr. Bell." Judge Morrison looked at Marcus expectantly. Marcus took a deep breath. This was the moment. Either he could present the evidence Jerome had discovered in a way that would help Dana, or he could fumble it and watch her go to prison for crimes she didn't commit. "Your Honor, the defense intends to introduce evidence showing that the financial irregularities Ms. Royce discovered were part of an ongoing money laundering operation that she was not involved in creating or managing. This testimony establishes her lack of knowledge about the true nature of these databases." Judge Morrison studied Marcus for a moment, and he had the sense she was taking his measure, not as a lawyer, but as a man trying to do right by someone he cared about. I'll allow the witness to describe what she observed, but not to speculate about the meaning or legality of what she found. Continue, Ms. Royce. Dana nodded, understanding the boundaries. I found records of financial transactions involving companies I'd never heard of, moving money to and from accounts that weren't part of our regular business operations. The amounts were significant, millions of dollars over several months, but I couldn't determine the business purpose. What happened next? I printed out records of everything I'd found and brought them to Jonathan. I told him I was concerned that someone might be using our systems without authorization, that we might have a security breach. Dana's voice grew quieter. That was the day he asked me to sign the updated governance documents. Marcus saw several jury members lean forward. Did he explain why you needed to sign these documents right at that moment? He said it was urgent, that the board had identified some compliance issues that needed to be addressed immediately. He seemed very stressed, very worried about regulatory problems. Dana looked directly at Marcus. I trusted him. We'd been business partners for 15 years. If he said something was urgent, I believed it was. Ms. Royce, in your opinion, was signing those documents connected to the financial irregularities you'd discovered? Objection. I'll withdraw the question. Your Honor. Marcus had gotten what he needed. The jury could connect the dots themselves. As he returned to the defendant's table, Marcus caught sight of Jerome in the gallery, giving him a small nod of approval. They weren't done yet. They still needed to present the banking evidence, still needed to prove that Dana had been deliberately framed, but they'd taken the first crucial step in establishing her innocence. More importantly, Marcus could see in Dana's face that for the first time since this ordeal began, she believed they might actually win. That evening, Marcus sat in Dana's former office at Royce Technologies, surrounded by boxes of documents that told the story of a company built on genuine innovation, slowly corrupted by greed. Jerome had arranged access through his federal contacts, and Dana's assistant, a loyal woman named Patricia, who'd refused to believe her boss was guilty, had stayed late to help them navigate 15 years of corporate records. Look at this, Dana said, holding up a handwritten business plan dated 1995. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in her neat handwriting and hand-drawn diagrams. This was my original vision for the company, democratizing technology, making powerful software tools accessible to small businesses, creating jobs in communities that had been left behind by the tech boom. Marcus studied the document, seeing traces of the idealistic young woman he'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. The business plan talked about fair wages, employee ownership, giving back to the community, principles that seemed quaint compared to the corporate empire Royce Technologies had become. What happened? He asked gently. Jonathan happened, not all at once, but gradually. At first, his suggestions made sense. We needed to scale up, to compete with larger companies, to maximize our market share. But somewhere along the way, growth became more important than purpose. Dana's voice carried the weight of dreams deferred. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that once we established ourselves, we could return to the original vision. But there's never a good time to sacrifice profit for principles. Patricia looked up from the box she'd been sorting. Ms. Dana, you never sacrificed your principles. Even when Mr. Jonathan was pushing for layoffs to boost quarterly numbers, you found ways to retrain people, to move them to different departments. You never forgot where you came from. Marcus felt something warm settle in his chest, hearing confirmation of what he'd always believed about Dana's character. But he also sensed there was more to the story. Layers of compromise and disappointment that had led to this moment. Dana, when did you first realize that Jonathan might not share your values anymore? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her original business plan as if it could transport her back to a simpler time when right and wrong seemed clearer. About 3 years ago, we had a board meeting where Jonathan proposed moving our manufacturing overseas. Not because we couldn't afford to keep production domestic, but because the profit margins would be higher abroad. And you opposed it? I fought it hard. We employed 300 people in our Michigan facility. Good people, many of them from the kind of working-class backgrounds Jonathan and I both came from. I couldn't see throwing them aside just to make our investors a little richer. Patricia nodded emphatically. She threatened to resign if the board approved the move, said she wouldn't be part of a company that abandoned its own community. What happened? Dana's laugh was bitter. Jonathan backed down, but only temporarily. He started having private conversations with board members, building support for his position while undermining mine. Within 6 months, I found myself increasingly excluded from strategic discussions. I was still CEO in name, but the real decisions were being made without me. Marcus made notes on his legal pad, seeing how the financial fraud fitted into this larger pattern of manipulation. That's when the shell companies started appearing, isn't it? When Jonathan realized he needed to find ways to access company money without your oversight. It makes sense now, but I was so focused on the technology side that I didn't see what was happening with the finances. I thought I could trust him to handle that aspect of the business while I concentrated on product development. Dana shook her head. I was naive. You were betrayed, Marcus said firmly. There's a difference. They worked until nearly midnight, piecing together a timeline of Jonathan's increasing control over the company's financial operations and Dana's gradual isolation from decision-making processes. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd built something beautiful, only to watch it be twisted into something she no longer recognized. But more than that, Marcus found himself rediscovering the woman he'd fallen in love with 3 decades ago. Not the successful CEO from the business magazines, but the idealistic programmer who dreamed of changing the world through technology. She was older now, scarred by disappointment and betrayal, but the essential core of her remained unchanged. The intelligence, the integrity, the fierce loyalty to people she cared about. As they gathered up documents to take back to Marcus's garage for further study, Dana caught his arm. Marcus, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you doing this because you believe I'm innocent, or because you feel guilty about what happened between us 30 years ago? The question caught him off guard. Not because he hadn't thought about it, but because he hadn't expected her to voice it so directly. They were alone in the office now. Patricia had gone home an hour earlier, and the overhead fluorescents cast harsh shadows that made Dana look older, more fragile than she had in the courtroom. Both, he said honestly. I believe you're innocent, because I know who you are, fundamentally. You're someone who would rather sacrifice herself than hurt other people. But yes, I also feel guilty about letting you go 30 years ago without fighting for us. Marcus, you didn't let me go. I made the choice to leave because I made it easy for you, because I was too proud or too scared or too convinced that you'd be better off without me to ask you to stay. Marcus set down the box he'd been carrying and turned to face her fully. I've spent 30 years wondering what would have happened if I'd gotten on that train to Chicago with you. Dana's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. You want to know what would have happened? You would have been miserable. You would have been surrounded by people who didn't understand you, working jobs that didn't fulfill you, slowly losing pieces of yourself to fit into a world that wasn't made for men like you. How can you be so sure? Because I've spent 30 years in that world, Marcus. I know what it costs. Dana moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, could see the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of too many late nights and too much stress. You think I was better off without you, but the truth is, I was never the same after I left you. Every success, every milestone, every achievement felt hollow because I wasn't sharing it with someone who understood why it mattered. Marcus felt something breaking open in his chest, 30 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of her honesty. Dana, I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty or to change what happened. I'm saying it because I need you. To know that defending me isn't something you owe me. It's something you're choosing to do because you're the kind of man who stands up for people he cares about, regardless of the personal cost. They stood facing each other in the empty office, surrounded by the detritus of a company that had started with such promise and ended in betrayal and fraud. Marcus could feel the pull between them, the same magnetic attraction that had brought them together as young people, tempered now by life experience and loss, but no less real. He thought of Sarah, of the wedding ring he still wore on a chain around his neck, of the promise he'd made to honor her memory. But he also thought of what Sarah had said about being grateful for love rather than guilty about it, about how the heart had room for more than one great truth. Dana, when this is over, when we prove your innocence and clear your name, I'd like to take you to dinner, somewhere that isn't the courthouse cafeteria. She smiled then, the brilliant, transformative smile he remembered from their youth. I'd like that very much. Good. But first, we have to make sure you're not spending the next 15 years in federal prison. Well, when you put it like that, it really puts things in perspective. As they gathered up the last of the documents and prepared to leave, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just hope that they could win Dana's case, though that was crucial. Hope that at 58 he might get a second chance at the kind of love that makes everything else worthwhile. But first, he had to prove that the woman he'd never stopped loving wasn't the criminal the prosecution claimed she was, and time was running out. The encrypted USB drive arrived at Marcus's garage at 6 in the morning, delivered by a nervous young man who identified himself only as a friend of Patricia's. He handed Marcus a manila envelope, mumbled something about the truth needs to come out, and disappeared before Marcus could ask any questions. Inside the envelope, along with the drive, was a note in Patricia's careful handwriting. Found this hidden in Mr. Jonathan's desk drawer. Thought you should see what's on it before anyone else does. Be careful. If he's willing to destroy Miss Dana to protect himself, there's no telling what else he might do. Marcus stared at the small device, no bigger than his thumb, but potentially containing the evidence that could free Dana or condemn them both. His hands, steady enough when rebuilding an engine or threading a bolt, shook slightly as he inserted the drive into his laptop. The files were encrypted, protected by the kind of sophisticated security that made Marcus grateful for Jerome's law. Enforcement contacts. He called his friend immediately, waking him from what sounded like the first good sleep Jerome had gotten in days. Marcus, it's 6 in the morning. This better be good. It's better than good. I think we just found the smoking gun. By 8 a.m., Jerome had arrived with a federal cybercrime specialist named Agent Sarah Chen, who took one look at the encryption and whistled low. This is military-grade security. Whoever set this up really didn't want anyone reading these files. Can you break it? Marcus asked. Give me an hour, Chen replied, already pulling out equipment that looked more like science fiction than anything Marcus had ever seen. While they waited, Marcus called the courthouse to request a delay in the day's proceedings. Judge Morrison was not pleased. Federal court schedules waited for no one, but she granted a 2-hour postponement when Marcus explained they'd discovered potentially exonerating evidence that required technical analysis. At exactly 9:30, Agent Chen looked up from her laptop with an expression Marcus couldn't read. You're going to want to see this. The files were a revelation, a digital paper trail that laid bare 15 months of financial crimes that made the prosecution's case against Dana look like a parking ticket. Shell companies, offshore accounts, money laundering on a scale that dwarfed what Jerome's initial investigation had uncovered. But the most damning evidence wasn't the financial records. It was the communications, email after email between Jonathan Royce and Michael Torres, discussing how to move money through their network of fake companies, text messages about timing their transactions to avoid detection, and most devastating of all, recorded phone conversations where they discussed framing Dana for their crimes. Jesus, Jerome whispered, scrolling through transcripts that laid out the conspiracy in brutal detail. "They'd been planning this for over a year." Marcus read over his friend's shoulder, his anger growing with each revelation. Jonathan and Torres hadn't just stolen from the company, they'd systematically destroyed Dana's reputation and professional relationships to isolate her. The board members who'd stopped taking her calls, the senior staff who'd avoided her, the investors who'd withdrawn their support, all of it orchestrated by men she'd trusted with her life's work. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Agent Chen pulled up a series of documents that made Marcus's blood run cold. "These are merger documents," she explained. "Looks like your friend Jonathan had a buyer lined up for Royce Technologies, a defense contractor that wanted the company's cybersecurity patents. But there was a problem. Dana wouldn't sell," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. "More than that, according to these emails, Dana was actively working to block the sale. She discovered that the buyer had connections to some pretty unsavory government contracts, weapons systems, surveillance technology. She thought selling to them would betray everything the company was supposed to stand for." Jerome looked up from the phone transcripts he'd been reading. "So they decided to remove her from the equation permanently, frame her for fraud, send her to prison, then sell the company while she's locked up. But there's more," Agent Chen continued, her voice grim. "Look at this timeline. The anonymous tip that triggered the SEC investigation, it came from a burner phone registered to one of Jonathan's shell companies. They didn't just frame her, they personally delivered her to law enforcement." Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd known that Jonathan had betrayed Dana professionally, but this was something darker. A calculated destruction of someone he'd once claimed to love. "There's something else," Agent Chen said quietly. "These files suggest that Dana's life might be in danger. Look at this email exchange from last week. The messages were cryptic but chilling. Jonathan and Torres discussing contingency plans and loose ends that need tying up. References to contacts who could solve problems permanently. A discussion about whether Dana might have insurance policies that could implicate them if she ever got free. They're planning to have her killed," Marcus said, the words feeling unreal as he spoke them. "It looks that way. And if she dies in prison or in some kind of staged accident, they inherit her shares of the company and can proceed with the sale unimpeded." Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "We need to get her into protective custody immediately." "Wait," Jerome grabbed his arm. "If we reveal this evidence to the court right now, Jonathan and Torres will know we're on to them. They might accelerate their timeline, try to get to Dana before we can protect her." Agent Chen nodded. "Plus, some of this evidence was obtained through means that might not be admissible in court. We need to be strategic about how we use it." Marcus felt torn between his desire to protect Dana immediately and his need to ensure that the evidence would hold up in court. But as he looked at the phone transcripts again, one detail caught his attention, a reference to a meeting scheduled for that evening at a warehouse owned by one of their shell companies. "What if we don't have to choose?" he said slowly. "What if we can use this evidence to catch them in the act of destroying more evidence, or worse?" Jerome followed his thinking immediately. "A sting operation. We let them think they're in control while we gather evidence that will definitely be admissible in court." "It's risky," Agent Chen warned. "If they realize they're being watched, or if something goes wrong, Dana's life is already at risk," Marcus interrupted. "At least this way, we're taking some control of the situation instead of just reacting to their moves." They spent the next hour developing a plan. Agent Chen would coordinate with federal authorities to set up surveillance on the warehouse meeting. Jerome would use his contacts to ensure Dana was placed in protective custody without alerting the prosecution to the new evidence. And Marcus would return to court and continue Dana's defense as if nothing had changed, buying them time to catch Jonathan and Torres in the act of destroying evidence, or worse. It was a dangerous game, but as Marcus looked at the evidence, of Jonathan's betrayal spread across his laptop screen. He felt a cold determination settle over him. These men had stolen Dana's company, destroyed her reputation, and were planning to take her life. They'd underestimated her once. They'd made the fatal error of assuming a small-town mechanic couldn't outthink them. As Marcus prepared to return to court, Agent Chen handed him a small device that looked like a pen, but contained sophisticated recording equipment. If you get a chance to talk to Jonathan privately, try to get him to admit to something on the record. People like him love to gloat when they think they've won. Marcus pocketed the device, thinking about the conversation he'd had with Dana the night before, about second chances and the courage to fight for people you care about. 30 years ago, he'd let her walk away because he was too afraid to fight for their love. This time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. Dana Royce was waiting for him outside the courthouse, impeccably dressed as always, wearing the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. "Marcus, isn't it? I have to say, I admire your dedication to Dana. It's really quite touching, this whole knight in shining armor routine." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Just trying to make sure an innocent woman doesn't go to prison." "Innocent?" Jonathan's laugh was cold, calculated. "Marcus, Dana's many things, but innocent isn't one of them. She's been stealing from the company for months, using her access to move money around, covering her tracks. I tried to stop her, tried to reason with her, but—" He shrugged eloquently. "Some people are just fundamentally dishonest. And you'd know about dishonesty, wouldn't you, Jonathan? I know about loyalty, about protecting the company I helped build from people who would destroy it." Jonathan's smile never wavered. "Dana's going to prison, Marcus. And when she does, I'm going to make sure Royce Technologies continues to thrive. It's what she would have wanted, really, if she'd been thinking clearly." As Jonathan walked away, Marcus touched the recording device in his pocket. They had him now. Not completely, not enough to convict him yet, but enough to know they were on the right track. Tonight, when Jonathan met with his co-conspirators to plan Dana's destruction, federal agents would be listening. And tomorrow, Marcus would present evidence that would not only free the woman he loved, but ensure that the men who'd betrayed her spent the rest of their lives behind bars. The game was just beginning, and for the first time since this ordeal started, Marcus was sure they were going to win. The warehouse surveillance operation began at sunset, with Marcus positioned in an unmarked van across the street from the industrial complex where Jonathan and Torres had arranged to meet. Agent Chen sat beside him, monitoring multiple video feeds and radio communications from the federal agents positioned throughout the building. Jerome was inside, having gained access through his law enforcement credentials, wearing a wire and carrying backup recording equipment. "I can't believe I'm doing this," Marcus muttered, watching the empty parking lot through the van's tinted windows. 48 hours ago, I was replacing brake pads. Now I'm part of a federal sting operation. "Life has a way of surprising us," Agent Chen replied, adjusting the gain on one of her listening devices. "The important thing is that you're doing it for the right reasons." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "Dad, I'm proud of you. Mom would be proud too. Be careful tonight." He smiled despite the tension, grateful for his daughter's unwavering support, even when he was doing something that probably looked insane from the outside. At 7:15, a black BMW pulled into the parking lot. Jonathan emerged, looking around nervously before walking toward the warehouse entrance. 5 minutes later, a Mercedes followed, and Marcus recognized Michael Torres, even at a distance, tall, thin, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that were supposed to look effortless but probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. "Here we go," Agent Chen said into her radio. "Subjects have arrived. All units maintain position and stand by." Through his earpiece, Marcus could hear Jerome's voice, slightly distorted by the electronic transmission, but clear enough to follow the conversation as he positioned himself near the warehouse office where Jonathan and Torres were meeting. "Told you this was getting out of hand," Torres was saying, his voice tight with stress. "The mechanic's asking too many questions, getting too close to things he shouldn't know about." "Relax," Jonathan replied, and Marcus could hear the cold confidence in his voice, even through the static. Marcus Bell might be persistent, but he's also completely out of his depth. A small-town mechanic playing lawyer. The jury's going to see right through that act. But what if he doesn't? What if he actually manages to create reasonable doubt? There was a pause, and Marcus found himself holding his breath, waiting for Jonathan's response. "Then we move to Plan B. Dana has an accident. Car crash, maybe, or some kind of medical emergency in prison. These things happen, Michael, especially to people who know too much." Agent Chen looked at Marcus with grim satisfaction. "We've got him. That's conspiracy to commit murder, recorded and witnessed." But Jerome's voice came through the earpiece again, more urgent now. "They're not alone. I count at least 3 other men in the warehouse, and they look like professional muscle. This isn't just a planning meeting. They're preparing for immediate action." Marcus felt his blood chill. "They're not waiting for the verdict. They're going to move against Dana tonight." Agent Chen was already speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for backup and alerting the prison security team. But Marcus knew that by the time federal agents could coordinate with the correctional facility, it might be too late. Dana was in a minimum security prison, designed more for white-collar criminals than violent offenders. If Jonathan's people had infiltrated the system, she'd be defenseless. "I have to get to her," Marcus said, reaching for the van's door handle. "Marcus, no. You're not law enforcement. If you try to interfere with an ongoing operation, then arrest me later. Right now, Dana's life is more important than protocol." Agent Chen studied his face for a moment, seeing something there that made her nod. "Go. I'll coordinate with prison security and make sure they know you're coming. But Marcus, be careful. If Jonathan's willing to kill Dana to protect himself, he won't hesitate to kill you too." The drive to the federal correctional facility took 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which Marcus listened to Agent Chen's radio communications and tried not to think about what might be happening to Dana while he raced through the darkness. The prison was 40 miles outside the city, a modern complex that looked more like a corporate campus than a detention center, surrounded by well-maintained grounds and discreet security fencing. Marcus had called ahead, using Agent Chen's federal credentials to bypass the usual visitor protocols. The warden, a serious woman named Dr. Patricia Hughes, met him at the main entrance with a security detail that included armed guards and electronic surveillance equipment. "Mr. Bell, Agent Chen has briefed me on the situation. We've moved Ms. Royce to a secure holding cell and placed the entire facility on lockdown. But I have to tell you, if there's been a security breach, it could take hours to identify and neutralize the threat." "Can I see her? I need to make sure she's safe." Dr. Hughes hesitated. Normally that would be against protocol, but given the circumstances, yes. "Follow me." They walked through a series of corridors that seemed designed to disorient visitors, past common areas and administrative offices that were now eerily empty due to the lockdown. Marcus could hear his footsteps echoing off the polished floors, each sound amplifying the tension that coiled in his chest like a spring wound too tight. Dana's temporary cell was in the facility's administrative wing, a secure area normally reserved for prisoners requiring special protection. When Marcus saw her through the reinforced glass window, he felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. She was safe, unharmed, reading a book in the harsh fluorescent light. 5 minutes, Dr. Hughes said, unlocking the door. "And Mr. Bell, try not to let her see how worried you are. Stress is the last thing she needs right now." Dana looked up as he entered, and her face lit up with a smile that made all the fear and uncertainty of the last few hours worthwhile. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Visiting hours ended hours ago. I needed to make sure you were okay, he said, settling into the plastic chair across from her small table. There have been some developments in your case. He told her about the encrypted files, about Jonathan's recorded admission of conspiracy, about the federal investigation that was even now unfolding around the people who'd betrayed her. Dana listened in silence, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally a kind of sad resignation. I knew Jonathan had changed, she said quietly when Marcus finished. I knew he'd become someone I didn't recognize, but I never imagined he could be capable of something like this. People do terrible things when they're cornered, and Jonathan was more cornered than we realized. He'd been stealing from the company for over a year, using the money to finance personal investments that went bad. Framing you was his way of covering up his own crimes. Dana rubbed her temples, a gesture Marcus remembered from their youth when she was processing difficult information. All those years, all that work, building something I believed in, and he was willing to destroy it all to save himself. Dana, there's something else. Marcus reached across the table to take her hands. The evidence we found suggests that Jonathan was planning to have you killed. Tonight, possibly. That's why you're in protective custody. He watched the color drain from her face as the implications hit her. Killed? Marcus, She stopped, seeming to gather herself. How long have you known? A few hours. Agent Chen and Jerome are coordinating with federal authorities to arrest Jonathan and his accomplices. By tomorrow, this whole nightmare should be over. And then what? Even if Jonathan goes to prison, even if my name is cleared, what's left? The company's gone. My reputation is destroyed. Everyone I trusted has betrayed me. Dana's voice was steady, but Marcus could see tears gathering in her eyes. I'm 51 years old, Marcus. I don't know how to start over again. Marcus felt something break open in his chest. The same protective instinct that had driven him to stand up in that courtroom. But deeper now, more personal. You don't have to start over alone, he said quietly. I know it's complicated. I know we have 30 years of history to work through. But Dana, I never stopped caring about you. Not completely, not ever. She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read the truth written there. Marcus, you had a whole life without me. A wife who loved you, a daughter, a business you built from nothing. I can't ask you to give that up for someone who might not even deserve it. You're not asking. I'm offering. Marcus tightened his grip on her hands. Sarah's been gone for 5 years. Angela's grown and independent. The garage runs itself most days. For the first time since Sarah died, I have room in my life for something more than just getting by. And you want that something to be me, even after everything that's happened. Marcus thought about the question, about all the years of wondering what might have been, about the photograph he'd carried in his toolbox like a talisman, about the way his heart had recognized her even after 3 decades apart, especially after everything that's happened. Dana, you've been through hell, and you've come out the other side with your integrity intact. That's not common. That's not something you find every day. Before Dana could respond, Dr. Hughes appeared at the cell door. Mr. Bell, I need to speak with you. There's been a development. Marcus followed the warden out into the corridor, where Agent Chen was waiting with an expression that could have been relief or concern. It was difficult to tell in the harsh institutional lighting. The warehouse operation was a success, Chen reported. We arrested Jonathan, Torres, and 3 other men, all of whom were carrying weapons and detailed plans for infiltrating this facility. You were right. They were planning to move against Dana tonight. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. So it's over? The immediate threat is over. Jonathan and Torres are in federal custody, and the evidence we've gathered should be enough to clear Dana completely and convict them of conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted murder. Agent Chen paused. But there's something else. Jonathan made a statement during his arrest that you should know about. What kind of statement? He claimed that Dana knew about the money laundering from the beginning, that she was a willing participant who only turned against him when she realized the FBI was closing in. Agent Chen's expression was apologetic. It's obviously a lie, given everything we've uncovered, but his lawyer might try to use it to create reasonable doubt about Dana's complete innocence. Marcus felt anger flare in his chest, but it was a clean anger now, focused and purposeful. Let him try. Tomorrow I'm going to present evidence that will not only clear Dana's name, but make sure Jonathan Royce spends the rest of his life in prison where he belongs. As he prepared to leave the facility, Marcus looked back through the reinforced glass at Dana, who was sitting quietly in her temporary cell, looking more peaceful than he'd seen her since this ordeal began. Tomorrow, he would stand in front of a jury and deliver the closing argument of his unlikely legal career. He would tell them about corporate greed and personal betrayal, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the importance of believing in people's fundamental goodness, even when the evidence seems stacked against them. But tonight, he just wanted to go home to his garage, to sit with the photograph he'd carried for 30 years, and prepare to fight the most important battle of his life. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Marcus rose to deliver his closing argument. News crews lined the back wall, reporters filled every available seat, and a crowd of supporters from Millbrook sat in the gallery like a small-town congregation gathered to witness something miraculous. Angela was in the front row, giving him an encouraging nod. Jerome sat beside her, his detective's eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. Marcus had spent the night preparing, writing his argument on the same yellow legal pad he'd used. Throughout the trial, crafting words that came not from law school textbooks he'd never read, but from 5 decades of life experience and an unshakable belief in the woman sitting at the defendant's table. Judge Morrison called the court to order, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom with the authority of 3 decades on the federal bench. "Mr. Bell, you may proceed with your closing argument." Marcus stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He walked to the podium, his work-worn hands steady on the smooth wooden surface, and looked out at the jury, 12 men and women who would decide whether Dana spent the next 15 years in prison or walked free to rebuild her life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had finally found his footing. 5 days ago, I was a mechanic. I fixed cars, changed oil, helped people get where they needed to go. I never imagined I'd be standing in a federal courtroom, and I certainly never imagined I'd be fighting for someone's life the way I'm fighting for Dana Royce's life today. He paused, making eye contact with each juror, letting them see the man he was, not a polished lawyer with expensive suits and practiced rhetoric, but someone like them, someone who understood that justice wasn't about legal technicalities, but about fundamental questions of right and wrong. The prosecution wants you to believe that Dana Royce is a criminal, a greedy CEO who stole millions of dollars from her own company and lied to investors. They've shown you bank records and financial statements, signatures and SEC filings, all designed to make you think that the woman sitting at that table is someone who put personal profit ahead of everything else. Marcus turned to look at Dana, who was watching him with an expression of trust so complete it took his breath away. "But I want to tell you about the Dana Royce I know. Not the CEO, not the defendant, but the woman who started her company 30 years ago, with a handwritten business plan that talked about democratizing technology, creating good jobs in forgotten communities, giving back to the people and places that had given her so much." He walked closer to the jury box, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "The prosecution has shown you numbers, but they haven't shown you the people. They've shown you financial transactions, but they haven't shown you the 300 workers in Michigan who kept their jobs because Dana refused to move manufacturing overseas. They've shown you stock prices, but they haven't shown you the thousands of small businesses that grew and thrived because Dana's company gave them access to technology they never could have afforded otherwise." Marcus could feel the courtroom's attention focusing, the way a room sometimes does when someone is speaking fundamental truth instead of practiced persuasion. The prosecution wants you to believe that Dana Royce signed those SEC filings knowing they contained false information. But the evidence shows something else entirely. It shows a woman who was systematically deceived by people she trusted, isolated from the financial decisions that were being made in her name, manipulated by business partners who saw her idealism as a weakness to be exploited. He pulled out a photograph, not the one from his toolbox, but a corporate headshot from Dana's early days as CEO, when she still looked like the young woman who had dreamed of changing the world through technology. This is Dana Royce, as she was 15 years ago, when Royce Technologies was founded, young, idealistic, believing that business could be a force for good in the world. And this, he gestured toward the defendant's table, where Dana sat with quiet dignity despite everything she'd endured. This is Dana Royce today, older certainly, scarred by betrayal and disappointment, but fundamentally the same person, someone who would rather sacrifice herself than hurt others, someone who built her life around the belief that technology should serve people, not the other way around. Marcus walked back to the podium, his closing words forming in his mind with the clarity that comes from absolute conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has asked you to convict Dana Royce based on her signature on documents she never fully understood, prepared by people who were actively deceiving her. They've asked you to believe that a woman who spent her career fighting for workers' rights and ethical business practices suddenly decided to become a common thief. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd learned. About justice, about truth, about the courage it takes to stand up for someone when the whole world seems arrayed against them. But I'm asking you to look deeper. Look at the pattern of isolation that preceded the alleged crimes. Look at the way Dana was systematically excluded from financial meetings in the months before the SEC investigation began. Look at the encrypted files that show her business partners discussing how to frame her for their own crimes. Look at the recorded conversations where Jonathan Royce and Michael Torres planned not just to destroy her professionally, but to have her killed to cover up their conspiracy. Marcus could see several jurors leaning forward now, their attention completely focused on his words. In the gallery, he caught sight of Angela wiping tears from her eyes, and Jerome nodding with the satisfied expression of a detective who'd seen justice finally taking its proper course. The defense has presented evidence that Dana Royce was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by people she trusted, designed to make her take the blame for crimes she didn't commit. We've shown you bank records proving that the shell companies used for money laundering were created without her knowledge. We've played you recordings of her accusers admitting their guilt and planning her destruction. We've demonstrated that every piece of evidence the prosecution claims proves her guilt actually proves her innocence. Marcus paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the jurors' minds. Then he spoke the words that had been building in his heart since the moment he'd stood up in this courtroom 5 days ago. I'm not a lawyer, and I've never pretended to be one. But I know something about integrity, about the difference between people who build things and people who destroy them. Dana Royce spent her career building technology that helped others, building a company that created good jobs, building a life based on the belief that success should lift up everyone around you, not just yourself. He turned one final time to look at Dana, who was watching him with an expression of gratitude and love that made everything he'd risked, everything he'd sacrificed, feel worthwhile. Jonathan Royce and Michael Torres are destroyers. They destroyed Dana's company, her reputation, her freedom, and they were prepared to destroy her life to protect their own crimes. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated the power of truth, and they underestimated the courage of people who refused to let injustice stand. Marcus's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who had found his calling in the most unlikely place. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to look at the evidence with clear eyes and open hearts. Look at what Dana Royce built. Look at what she stood for. Look at the way she conducted herself, even in the face of betrayal and false accusation. Then ask yourself, is this a woman who would steal from her own company, lie to her own investors, betray everything she spent her life building? He walked back toward the defendant's table, his final words spoken not to the jury, but to the courtroom as a whole, to the reporters who would carry this story across the country, to anyone who had ever been wrongfully accused or abandoned by people they trusted. The answer is no. Dana Royce is not a criminal. She's a victim of criminals, a woman who was betrayed by people she loved and trusted, framed for crimes she didn't commit by men who saw her idealism as a weakness to be exploited. Justice demands her acquittal, decency demands her vindication, and the truth demands that you send her home where she belongs. As Marcus returned to his seat, the courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, caught up in the power of words spoken from the heart rather than calculated for effect. Judge Morrison nodded with what might have been approval, and the jury sat with the thoughtful expressions of people who had heard something that would stay with them long after the verdict was rendered. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Marcus felt certain they were going to win. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 27 minutes. Marcus knew, because he spent every one of those minutes pacing the courthouse corridors, checking his phone, drinking bad coffee from vending machines, and trying not to think about what would happen if they lost. Dana had been remarkably calm during the wait, sitting in the attorney-client conference room with a book she wasn't really reading, occasionally looking up to give Marcus an encouraging smile when his agitation became too obvious. Angela and Jerome had stayed with them, providing moral support and helping Marcus resist the urge to second-guess every word of his closing argument. "Dad, you did everything you could," Angela said for the 10th time as Marcus wore a path in the linoleum floor. "Whatever happens now, you gave her a real defense. You gave her hope." "Hope doesn't keep people out of prison," Marcus replied, immediately regretting the sharpness in his voice. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm just scared," Dana said quietly, from her place at the conference table. "We're all scared. It's okay to admit it." Jerome looked up from his phone, where he'd been monitoring news coverage of the trial. "The legal experts on CNN think you did well, Marcus. They're saying it's the most compelling closing argument by a non-lawyer they've ever seen." "Legal experts don't vote on juries," Marcus muttered, but he felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. He'd done his best. That would have to be enough. When the bailiff finally appeared in the doorway to announce that the jury had reached a verdict, Marcus felt his heart stop for a moment before resuming at double speed. The walk back to the courtroom felt like a march to execution, each step heavy with the weight of everything that hung in the balance. The gallery was packed again, spectators and reporters having waited through the entire deliberation for this moment. Marcus could see Patricia, Dana's loyal assistant, in the 3rd row, her hands clasped in prayer. Several workers from the Michigan plant had made the trip, their faces showing the same mixture of hope and anxiety that Marcus felt churning in his own chest. Judge Morrison took her place at the bench with the measured dignity that had characterized her handling of the entire trial. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," replied the jury foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as a high school principal and had listened to every word of testimony with the focused attention of someone accustomed to separating truth from deception. "Will the defendant please rise?" Dana stood slowly, Marcus beside her, both of them facing the jury with whatever courage they could muster. Marcus could feel Dana's hand trembling slightly where it rested on the table, and he covered it with his own, offering what comfort he could in what might be their final moments together as free people. "On the count of securities fraud, how do you find?" The foreman looked directly at Dana, his expression unreadable. "We find the defendant not guilty." A wave of sound swept through the courtroom. Gasps, exclamations, the scratch of pens on paper as reporters rushed to record the verdict. But Marcus heard none of it, his entire focus on the words that would determine Dana's fate. On the count of wire fraud, how do you find? Not guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find? Not guilty. Marcus felt Dana sag against him, her strength finally giving way as the reality of acquittal sank in. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her steady as Judge Morrison continued reading the verdict on each count. Not guilty. Not guilty, not guilty. 12 charges dismissed. 12 counts of justice served. When the last not guilty was read, the courtroom erupted. Angela was on her feet, tears streaming down her face. Jerome was grinning with the satisfaction of a detective who'd seen the right person finally caught. The supporters from Millbrook were cheering as if their hometown team had won the championship. But Marcus only had eyes for Dana, who was looking at him with an expression of gratitude and love that made everything he'd risked, everything he'd sacrificed, feel like the smallest price imaginable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the celebration around them. "Marcus, I—" Before she could finish, federal marshals were escorting Jonathan Royce and Michael Torres into the courtroom in handcuffs. Their arrests had been coordinated to coincide with Dana's acquittal, ensuring that justice was not only served, but seen to be served. Jonathan looked older, diminished, his expensive suit rumpled from his night in federal custody. When his eyes met Dana's across the courtroom, she saw not the man she'd once loved, but a stranger who had been willing to destroy her to save himself. "Ms. Royce," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying over the slowly quieting courtroom, "you are free to go. The court apologizes for the ordeal you have endured and wishes you well in rebuilding your life." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Marcus and Dana were surrounded by reporters, shouting questions, supporters offering congratulations, and the general chaos that accompanies the end of a highly publicized trial. But Marcus felt strangely detached from it all, focused instead on the woman beside him who was finally truly free. On the courthouse steps, in front of the cameras and microphones, Dana turned to address the crowd that had gathered to witness her vindication. "I want to thank everyone who believed in my innocence, everyone who supported me through this difficult time," she said, her voice stronger than Marcus had heard it in days. "But most of all, I want to thank the man who risked everything to defend me when I had no one else to turn to, Marcus Bell, who proved that sometimes the best lawyers aren't the ones with law degrees, but the ones with courage and conviction." She turned to look at him, her eyes bright with tears of relief and gratitude. "Marcus, I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Marcus thought about his answer for a moment, about all the ways their lives had intersected and separated and come together again. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in days. "Have dinner with me," he said, "somewhere that isn't a courthouse cafeteria." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his garage workshop, watching Dana program security updates on his ancient computer system with the same focused concentration he remembered from their youth. She'd been coming by 3 afternoons a week since her acquittal, initially to help him modernize his business systems, but increasingly just to be near each other as they navigated the careful dance of rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted by 3 decades. The federal investigation had concluded, with Jonathan Royce and Michael Torres receiving 15-year prison sentences for conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted murder. Royce Technologies had been dissolved, its assets distributed to creditors and the pension funds that had been looted to finance Jonathan's schemes. Dana had recovered some of her personal losses, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to erase the betrayal of everything she'd built. "There," Dana said, saving her work and turning to face him with a satisfied expression. "Your customer database is now backed up to 3 different cloud servers, your appointment system sends automatic reminders, and your inventory management We'll tell you when you're running low on parts, before you have to tell Mrs. Henderson that her transmission repair will take an extra week." Marcus laughed, still amazed by how naturally Dana had fitted back into his world. She'd rented a small apartment in Millbrook's downtown, walking distance from his garage, and had quietly become part of the community that had embraced her as the woman their hometown hero had risked everything to save. "What would I do without you?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Probably go back to keeping your business records in a shoebox like you did before I got here. Hey, that shoebox system worked for 15 years. It worked until you had to defend someone in federal court and needed to organize evidence quickly. Then it became clear that the 21st century had some advantages." Dana reached over to take his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the months they'd been rediscovering each other. "Speaking of evidence, did I tell you that Patricia got a job with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit? Turns out her organizational skills and attention to detail made her perfect for forensic accounting. She deserves it. She's the one who found the USB drive that broke the case open." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of Marcus's workshop, motor oil and metal, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. It was a world away from the corporate boardrooms and federal courthouses that had defined their lives 6 months ago, but it felt like home in a way that nowhere else ever had. "Marcus," Dana said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Standing up in that courtroom, risking your reputation, your business, your relationship with Angela, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just stayed home that day?" Marcus considered the question seriously, thinking about the alternative timeline where he'd watched Dana's trial on the evening news like everyone else, where he'd shaken his head at the tragedy of it all and gone back to his quiet life above the garage. "I regret that it took 30 years and a federal fraud trial for us to find our way back to each other," he said finally. "But I don't regret standing up for you. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd let you face that alone, even knowing what you know now about how complicated it would be. The media attention, the business disruption, the way some people still think I'm guilty despite the verdict." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Dana, I spent 22 years married to a wonderful woman who knew about the photograph in my toolbox and never asked me to throw it away because she understood that love isn't diminished by being shared. It's strengthened by it. Sarah knew that I loved her completely while still carrying feelings for you, and she was secure enough in our relationship to let that be okay." He paused, thinking about Sarah's wisdom, about the conversations they'd had about love and loss and the heart's capacity for multiple truths. "The night before she died, Sarah told me that if anything happened to her, she hoped I wouldn't spend the rest of my life alone. She said that the love we'd built together was strong enough to survive death, and that finding someone else to share my life with wouldn't diminish what we'd had. It would honor it." Dana's eyes filled with tears. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman." "She was, and she would have liked you, I think. You both believed that people should be judged by how they treat others when they have nothing to gain from kindness. I hope I would have measured up to her standards." Marcus smiled, thinking about all the ways Dana had proven her character over the past months, helping elderly customers with their computer problems despite having no obligation to do so, volunteering at the community center to teach basic technology skills, quietly paying off the medical bills of 3 families in town who'd been struggling with healthcare costs. "Dana, you've spent 6 months in Millbrook, and in that time you've helped more people than most folks do in a lifetime. Mrs. Peterson's granddaughter got into college because you helped her with her application essays. Tommy Rodriguez's auto shop is thriving because you designed his website and taught him how to use social media for marketing. The community center's after-school program has new computers because you convinced your contacts in Chicago to donate their old equipment. Those were small things that made big differences in people's lives. That's what Sarah would have noticed about you. Not the CEO success story, not the federal trial drama, but the way you see people who need help and find ways to help them. Dana leaned over and kissed him softly, a kiss that tasted of forgiveness and second chances, and the particular sweetness that comes from love that has survived separation and loss and found its way home. When they broke apart, Marcus reached into his toolbox and pulled out the photograph that had lived there for 30 years. Two young people laughing at a company picnic, their whole lives spread out before them like an unwritten book. "I think it's time to update this," he said, pulling out his phone. "Angela's coming for dinner tonight, and Jerome's bringing his new girlfriend. We should have a picture of our new life, not just our old one." As Dana settled against his shoulder for the selfie, both of them older now, marked by loss and betrayal, and the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving life's unexpected trials. Marcus felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, complete contentment. The photograph he took would go on his desk at the garage, next to the old one, but not replacing it. Both pictures told part of the story. The love they'd found and lost and found again, the circuitous path that had brought them back to each other, the truth that some connections are strong enough to survive decades of separation and emerge stronger on the other side. 6 months ago, Marcus Bell had been a widowed mechanic with a quiet life and no expectation that anything significant would ever happen to him again. Today, he was a man who discovered that it's never too late for second chances, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the best defense of all is simply refusing to give up on people you love. Outside the garage, the sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Marcus of the evening he'd first kissed Dana 30 years ago. Some things, he thought, were worth waiting for. Some loves were strong enough to survive anything, and some stories, even when they seemed to be over, were really just beginning.